Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining this CGD event today, which we're very pleased to co-convene with Humentum. This event stems from a CGD research project called Rethinking Humanitarian Reform, where we look into how power imbalance and systems of influence and incentives in the humanitarian business model, whether it's about financing or coordination, continue to affect our ability to support people-driven, locally led humanitarian action. The role of governance in that power imbalance is key. The lack of representation in governing structures contributes to underestimating the views of people and communities in the sector, but it's often been overlooked. So today, Rose Warden and I are publishing a new policy note and dashboard looking specifically at representation in NGO governing boards, which hopefully starts to unpack some of these issues. And I will let Rose present that piece in a minute. Of course, governing boards is only one part of the picture. So I'm very pleased that we have a fantastic group of panelists with us today to give us a different set of perspectives on this issue. Dr. Christine So will be our moderator today. Christine is Humentum's CEO and president. And prior to joining Humentum, she had a long career in international development, providing technical assistance and leading operations for Palladium, Population Services International, UNICEF, and USAID, amongst others. She recently relaunched and led the Global Health Council, which connects advocates, implementers, and stakeholders around global health priorities worldwide. We are very privileged to have the Honorable Ratna Omitvar with us today. She's the Senator for Ontario, Canada, and she will be our first panelist. Senator Omitvar is an internationally recognized voice on migration, diversity, and inclusion. She has over 30 years of experience working in the charitable sector at senior levels and has served as a board director and advisor on over 30 charitable boards. She is currently a director at the Samara Center for Democracy and at the Century Initiative. She's a member of the World Refugee and Migration Council and chair emerita at the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. She has also served as deputy chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector in Canada. I'm very grateful for your time today, Senator, as I know how busy you are. Degan Ali is the executive director of ADESO, a humanitarian and development organization that's changing the way people think about and deliver aid in Africa. Degan has been leading the Decolonization development movement and was the architect of the Grand Bargain commitment to provide 25% of humanitarian funding to go directly to local organizations. She has also co-founded the Network for Empowered Aid Response, the NEAR Network, which is a global South civil society network trying to transform the current humanitarian and development system. And she has advised international NGOs, the Red Cross, on aligning organizational strategy with anti-colonial and anti-racist principles. Dylan Matthews is CEO of Peace Direct, a UK-based peace-building organization that supports local peace-building efforts in 13 countries around the world. He has worked to support local organizations in the Global South for almost 20 years in the peace-building, development, and humanitarian sectors. He's the vice chair of the Alliance for Peace Building, which is based in Washington, DC, and is a member of the steering group for Plus Peace, which is a campaign platform for peace building organizations worldwide. Lena Biru is an anti-racism activist, organizer, and campaigner. She leads the anti-racism work for BOND, the network of UK organizations working in international development. She has rolled out support to create an actively anti-racist sector. Lena has created a POC in development working group, and she's a working group member of the Racial Equity Index that aims to hold the global development sector to account on racial equity. She's also a committee member and organizer at Charity So White, the award-winning campaign to root out racism from the UK charity sector. A warm welcome to you all. And before I hand over to Rose for her presentation, I wanted to flag to our online audience that if you have questions or comments for Rose or our panelists, you can email them to events@cgdev.org. You can also tweet using the handle @cgdev or the hashtag CGDtalks, or you can submit your comments via YouTube. Thank you very much again for participating, and I'll hand over to Rose for her presentation now. You're muted, Rose.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to everyone for joining today, and thank you to our panelists for being here. As Patrick mentioned, as the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of accelerated calls to decolonize aid, one area that has been somewhat overlooked in the discussion is governance. And that is even though governing boards are really the seat of power in an organization and therefore really in the sector as in other sectors. And so we thought it would be important to take a look at what humanitarian INGOs are prioritizing in their governing board membership. So since a lot of the policies, again, on increasing accountability, transparency, feedback, and communication often occur at the program level, and it's not always clear how people who receive services from these organizations are able to impact the design of programs that impact their lives, we think it's also important for that communication to feed into the governance level. So looking at 10 of the largest humanitarian INGOs, including European, Canadian, and US-based organizations, we assessed the board membership for 5 areas of technical competencies and 4 demographic characteristics. It was really sort of a stock-taking exercise to begin to paint an aggregate picture of governance in the sector. This way, we can begin to understand why governing boards look how they do and begin discussing how governance can adapt or change to allow increased diversity and even possibly some form of direct representation of people in the organizations. So of the 5 areas of competency, we looked at financial management and administration, fundraising, nonprofit leadership, aid subject matter expertise, and policy influence. And we found that organizations prioritize these in that order. So most featured financial management and administration and fundraising expertise, and fewer had aid subject matter expertise. On the demographic side, we looked at gender, ethnicity, national origin, and representation in terms of people's lived experience, either in humanitarian crisis or as a refugee at some point, and found that the sector does well overall in terms of gender parity. However, less than 30% of board members were non-white, fewer than 20% were from an aid eligible country, and fewer than 2% had experience as a refugee or in humanitarian crisis. So this really paints a picture that we're already basically familiar with, but it just highlights how different governance in the sector is on all these metrics compared to the populations these organizations exist to serve. And from there, we took the data and added it to a dashboard, which I will share with you now. And this basically, again, is just showing the aggregate look at the sector as we have created it so far with these 15 governing boards from 10 organizations. So you can see financial management, administration, and fundraising quite high, aid subject matter much lower. This dashboard also allows you to Okay, from the
Rose?
dash, you can read statements from those organizations who decided to provide them. Have I lost you? Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yes?
We lost you for a bit.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, apologies, having an internet connectivity issue. So from the dashboard, basically you could just get an overall picture of the data that we have collected so far. You can see the characteristics and competencies here, read NGO statements from those organizations who have decided or opted to provide them, check out our methodology, and you can link back to the project that Patrick also mentioned earlier pertaining to. So thank you. I'll leave it there and pass it over to Christine.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today. Today's panel represents an important trend towards uncomfortable conversations in our humanitarian and development work that should and must lead to action and change. Increasingly, there is more attention being paid to how to be anti-racist and around the need to decolonize the sector. These concepts being inextricably interwoven, they are related but different, and it can be argued that one cannot happen without the other, and critically, both involve the reallocation of power. Recently, my organization, Humentum, has been working in a partnership led by Social Impact to carry out the Bridge survey, which examined diversity at the headquarters level of US international NGOs. That report was recently released and is available online. Bridge confirms what we already knew. Leaders responsible for governance in this sector are not diverse. US-based NGO leadership is 84% white, boards are 67% white. And as Rose has just noted, CGD's new policy note also shows us extremely low, unacceptable rates of representation from refugee geographies and people with lived experience. This raises the question about what kind of leadership representation should we have? Is it just a question of diversifying and having more representation from people of color from within headquarters geographies? Or rather, is it representation of constituent communities, or both? I would argue it needs to be both. It needs to be widely diverse, widely inclusive, and widely equitable, which right now it is not. In addition, DEI-related accountability and transparency are weak in our sector. The Bridge survey showed that only a quarter of responding international NGOs based in the US have a DEI policy in place, and only 20% share DEI-related demographics externally, and less share those demographics internally with their own staff and boards. While not covered in Bridge, I'd also just like to note that language matters. Paying attention to the terms we use, such as aid recipients and beneficiaries, when we could use a term such as constituents that is active and integrates notions of governance and accountability. Even if our programs lag behind in actioning these ideas, our aspirational language can pull us forward. We've got a great panel today. We'll be hearing from leaders in global development who are focused on advancing concepts of equity and inclusion, but also importantly on taking action. This action must include all parts of our sectors, our own organizations, and also donors and communities. Just as a reminder, please feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat, and we will do our best to incorporate them into the discussion as we go. I think it's a great thing if people can see that their ideas are actually being taken into account while we go along with our discussion. So please, I encourage you to do that. And those comments will be fed to me, actually not into the chat, but into the ways that Patrick already told us to use. With that, I am going to wrap up my own comments and turn the floor over to Senator Ratna Omanfar, the independent senator for Ontario. We are very honored to have her with us today. And I think that she is the embodiment of this idea of moving from conceptual to action. And so I think that we will hear very interesting comments from her. Senator, I'd like to start us off with a question around your work to decolonize the charitable sector in Canada. What are the main issues and how are they being resolved, or are they being resolved? Perhaps I should be saying addressed. Senator, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this panel. The issues that you have and CGD have put on the table today are of incredible importance, and I'm so gratified that someone is taking a look at the international sector, because most of my work is domestic in Canada, and I'm really pleased that I'm now connecting to this broader global movement, because for sure the time has come. In terms of Canada, I will say that there are a host of issues that continue to privilege a colonial mindset and structure in Canada's charities, both domestically and internationally. And there is legislation that reinforces colonialism, and there is, of course, governance. Let me briefly touch on legislation, and you will forgive me for being Canada-centric in this first comment. And people in this audience may not completely appreciate how much Canada has borrowed from the UK on the legislative front. And in many cases, even when the UK has introduced reforms, Canada continues to be stuck in what I would say in an Elizabethan past. And one such example is our Income Tax Act, which stipulates that charities working domestically or internationally must have total control of their charitable dollars, with rigid guardrails controlling partnerships, in particular with local groups. And this is, of course, incredibly important in the international context. It's common sense to realize that an international development charity headquartered in Canada must partner with a local group to achieve their charitable purpose. And such partnerships are only allowed in Canadian law if the Canadian charity exercise total direction and control. And colleagues, those are the two words in the law, direction and control, over a partnership many miles away. So, you know, I hope you understand how deeply embedded colonialism is in the Canadian context. There are significant impacts, and I'll just, paint a few. The Canadian charity, which works with a local group, must approve all public statements, include press releases. All IP generated by the local partner is the property of the headquartered charity. Every legally binding document must be signed by the charity, including leases and contracts for efforts held far away. And essentially, charities are required to take over the project generated by a non-charity. And the intent of our law, let me not confuse anyone, the intent of the law is to provide for accountability for charitably exempt tax dollars. And that is really important. But its unintended impact is the continued legacy of colonialism, with a really bitter aftertaste that local partners cannot be trusted with money, and therefore the West knows best. So recently, I introduced a legislation in the Canadian Senate to change the language in the Income Tax Act so you can have empowered relationship and accountability. I won't go into the details of the legislation. I am pleased to tell you that the legislation has passed the Senate and now has to go to the House of Commons, and hopefully, and these things take time, in the next couple of years, this change will become law. The next really big hindrance is governance, as there is little meaningful participation in governance from those who have the competencies, but also the deep connection to communities that are being served. Again, this can be dealt through by legislation. Now, I'm speaking as a legislator. I'm a huge believer in the power of legislation to change behaviors and possibly attitudes over time. In Canada, and I think in other parts of the world, corporations are required to disclose diversity demographics on their boards. This is not the case. It does not extend to the charitable sector. And I believe this is an opportunity for governments to step up to the plate and use the legislative measure to ensure that data is gathered in a reliable way, so that we have trend lines and we can plot and engage in change over time.
Thank you so much for these examples. I'm curious about how much you see discussion in the domestic charitable sector in Canada and the internationally focused charitable sector in Canada. And do you find that to be a reinforcing discussion, or are you having to really single out the international side of things and have a focus on that to move this forward?
No, I believe that the sector is suffering from a governance illness. I call it the diversity deficit on the governance of charities, and this is prevalent both in domestic charities and international charities. International charities in Canada make up roughly 8% or 10% of the 85,000 charities, and they are extremely influential, because even though the charitable aid that Canada sends overseas may not be large, it is complemented by government grants, and then it becomes a significant funding stream. I think what charities and philanthropy in Canada are being influenced by is the discourse of the day. And it is recognized more and more that philanthropy is really a bastion of privilege. And I think Darren Walker, the CEO and president of the Ford Foundation, said it best when he made the point that philanthropy is not about generosity. Generosity is about the donor. Generosity, he said, is insufficient. The real goal of giving should be justice. And when we talk about decolonizing the sector, we need to think about justice. And we need to recognize that the sector tends to reflect the histories of power and privilege. And this is really clear from the picture that has been painted by Rose and by Humentum. But there are structural issues, and I would like to sort of hopefully have a discussion about this. There are structural issues at play that are really important when we want to discuss the sharing of power and sharing of resources. It may be unrealistic in the short or even the midterm to accept that inclusive governance is in our immediate reach as INGOs, because they operate across multiple countries, and there is a large disconnect between the HQ level and operational matters on the ground. There are ways and means, though, of closing this gap. And one idea is to reconsider what Oxfam has done, not in its governance, because I've read your research, but Oxfam moved its headquarters to Africa. And this could be a shift worth thinking about. There may also come a time when aid receiving countries set their own rules and legislations and mandate how and where international aid charities can work in their countries. There is also a movement in my country, and I believe it may in fact be broader than my country, where funders and governments are beginning to privilege organizations that are Indigenous-led, Black-led, or refugee-led. And that is partly because I believe that the sector is largely aspirational in its efforts around D&I. As I have noticed, it says all the right things, but even if its spirit is willing, the flesh seems to be remarkably weak. So I will leave it at that and look for other ideas. I will make a comment about the disturbing trend of volunteerism, which seems to have, I mean, there are people who are very passionate about engaging young people and sending them overseas to work in development. But I question whether that is about what the constituency in the global South requires, or is it more about privilege in the West?
Yes, yes. I think going back to this idea of structure And you really laid out very well this idea of accountability and distrust. And I think that what we have seen is that accountability, which arguably is a positive concept, is used actually as a curtain or an excuse to promote distrust and to avoid issues of decolonization, because we say, oh, well, we have to have accountability. We have stakeholders, we have taxpayers, so there must be accountability, when in fact, that accountability is not really about true accountability. It's about treating people as infants, as unable to be responsible for their own actions, and that there is an innate sense of distrust in all of that idea of being able to deal directly with constituents, members of their own communities, managing their own programs and their own funding, and instead having these archaic rules and regulations, such as you've discussed for Canada. And so I think, what do you have thoughts on how do we move this conversation from accountability that masks distrust to accountability that is actually an active, positive force and allows people to have their own voice be heard in the work that's going on?
You've said it very well, Christine. I don't think accountability and empowerment, or accountability and local partnerships, and accountability and sharing of power are mutually exclusive. Those are, when we put ourselves into those buckets, then we are constrained. But if you find the linkages, as I hope I have in my legislation, that you can make the link between accountability, and you can make the link between to local empowerment, it is not impossible to do an and so that there is a win-win situation. Clearly, the construct that we have today is no longer workable as we move towards a greater realization of decolonization and a greater understanding of how privilege has accrued to the West, and on the backs, I would say, of many people and countries in the global South, and there is a greater understanding, especially within the young people in the world, to use the levers of justice to change the paradigm. And politicians will be moved by the people who vote for them. I'm a politician. I kind of know how this works. So you in the end, it is about politics and government and the will and the power to lead. But the ideas come from conversations like this.
Yeah. Well, you gave me a great segue into my next question, which is, you as a politician and as a legislator, how do you get traction? How do you build traction amongst your colleagues and peers to actually support and understand why this kind of legislation is important? Because I have to say, speaking from the US perspective, we are, famous for not being able to work across the aisle on these sorts of things. And how are you doing this?
Well, let me share something with you about Canada. We are a quiet country. We don't air our problems in the way, or they're not aired for us by the media as the ones in the United States. We have our problems too. But on this file, on charities, here's what worked to my advantage. Every senator, and we have 106, every senator is connected to a charity. They've sat on a board. They understood implicitly what I was talking about. They went back to their organizations and checked that out. So that was really terrific. And secondly, possibly even more importantly, I had Canada's entire charitable sector behind me. 85,000 charities who supported this measure, including Cooperation Canada, which is the largest member of organization for international charities. They have worked with me hand in hand. So when I stood and spoke in the Senate, I was really their voice. It was not me, it was their ideas. So stakeholders at the back of you who are organized to work with you and do all the work that is required for moving legislation up the needle. So
yeah, well, kudos to you. And I have to say, I think one of the things that really interests me about what you're describing is that, again, you are really moving from concept to action. And from your description of the way that the contractual side of things is set up for organizations to contain or to retain total control over those dollars, there will be a lot of follow-on work, presumably, that will need to happen to help organizations, charities, both in Canada and internationally with whom they work, to actually think through what the kind of back-end implications of this are in terms of how they work together, what those new contracts look like, what acceptable levels of accountability are if you do in fact loosen the control. And that's a second phase. And I have to say that interests me because that's really the part that Humentum works in and we're interested in, is how do you operationalize this change?
Exactly. So the two big questions are the flow of charitable dollars through international aid charities to terrorism. That's always a big deal. And the second is leakage, what you would call leakage of charitable dollars to non-charitable, purpose-driven activities. And we have to watch for that. Those are reasonable concerns, but I don't believe you'd legislate for 1% of the problem.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't believe you do that. So I'm pretty confident that with some good luck, the law will pass in a couple of years. It takes time. And I will tell you that if this law is passed, we will be then in the better company of our colleagues in the international development sector, such as the US. US is far more progressive than we are on this, the UK, Australia, and we will finally be able to participate in international pooled funds, which are, I believe, a really important way of getting the best bang for your buck, so to say. And we can't participate in them because guess what? We cannot direct and control pooled funds. There you have it.
Right. Well, thank you. With that, I want to thank you very much, and we're going to move on to our next speaker. I'm going to turn to Degan Ali. So pleased to speak with you today. I wanted to start off with a question around how humanitarian governance, either at the organization or system-wide level, impacts more locally led humanitarian assistance in Somalia. And so I think we're going from, very kind of high level donor governance to now thinking more about how we deal with humanitarian governance and what the implications are at the more organizational level, the local level, the community level, in terms of the real application of this funding in these approaches. So Degan, please, over to you.
Thank you, Christine, for having me. Yeah, I think the issues that are really things that we've been talking about for years. I think at the INGO level, the governance decisions that they make in terms of their business model and their strategies and how they work directly impact our operations on the ground. There is a great, very real connection between your priorities, where you prioritize spending your money, your resources. Do you become an institution that directly implements every single project and therefore has a lot of boots on the ground because you see yourselves as a savior, as being, critical to implementation because locals can't handle it, locals can't do it, just a very paternalistic attitude where you just have no trust for local capacity. And then you are much more controlling in your decisions, much more controlling in your relationship with local partners. I've experienced that many times in Somalia. A lot of those organizations that do a lot of direct implementations have a different way of working when their partnership is very subcontractor kind of relationship. There's no devolution of power. They just come to you with a project already signed, sealed, and delivered, designed in their HQs. You have no input into the design of projects. The communities have no input into any of this. Budgets are already done. They might have a $10 million funding from their back donor. They won't tell you they have $10 million. They'll just say to you, you only get 200,000. How do you program 200,000? And you're the direct implementer, yeah? So there should be a direct correlation between implementation with communities having a higher allocation of resources as opposed to the people who do the operational back end piece. But that's not how it works in the sector. The organizations that do direct implementation oftentimes get the least amounts of the budget, and most of the money is skimmed off for HQs, regional offices, and country office staff. So this to me is a form of kind of legalized corruption. When we talk about leakage, why isn't that called, why isn't that seen as a leakage? Because, you know, if you send $10 million to a project and 60-70% is spent on this kind of, you know, formalized corruption, most formalized leakage, then and very little gets into the hands of the communities, that's not going to create impact. And that's why I haven't seen any impact, to be honest with you. In my 20 plus years of experience in Somalia, I can't see any kind of transformation of communities that has happened by anybody in the aid sector, including us who are part of this machinery. And we have become complicit, and we acquiesce, and we just continue just to be blind, you know, actors in the sector, just accepting what the slave master says. And so we, of course, you know, we have been resisting this at the global level and then the national level, but many of us are still complicit. So I think there is the direct correlation. So it doesn't surprise me, these numbers from your survey or the other survey results. I have been saying this for a long time, that, you know, the power is held in the hands of these global North institutions, particularly in their boards. And the kind of decisions that you make in terms of the people that you put on your boards has an impact on us at the local level. If you put people who come from the global South, who have lived experience, who understand how to devolve power, who understand how racist it is to bring in a 25-year-old with no experience to supervise a 40-year-old in country because, you know, he is Black and he just can never be a country director, can never rise up in a position, and he's having to answer to a 25-year-old who just graduated. These are the kinds of things that happen every single day in Somalia, in Kenya, and many other parts of the world. So so there is the direct correlation. So your board steers the ship. And if that board doesn't have any, not only understanding, but real motivation to change these dynamics, then nothing will change. And the boards currently of NGOs have become so corporatized, this whole sector. And I always say this, that their metrics of success is about income. It's about how big we become, and their metrics of success, when they talk about impact, how much impact we have, is very much related to how much money we have. So the more money we have, the bigger the impact we have. There's a huge assumption that that is very, how should I say, narcissistic, that your expansion in the sector, the bigger you are as an institution, the more the impact you will have in the entire sector. It's a very kind of sick idea that I am central and pivotal to this whole sector, and I'm going to change the lives of millions of people in Somalia or Kenya or wherever it may be. And that's just not the case. I'm sorry to say, it doesn't happen. There is no real thinking about, maybe impact is about how I support and facilitate local leadership, and for them to make more decisions, and how I devolve power and how I devolve more resources to them and let them lead, let the government lead, let civil society lead. Maybe that it has more impact than the current status quo. So yeah, let me stop there.
No, thank you so much.
I can go on forever, Christine. So
that's great. And we will have more questions for you. So I want I wanted to push you a little bit. I mean, you used this great concept of being complicit. I mean, it's not a great concept, but you laid it out very clearly, of being complicit. And, you know, we all work in the aid sector. We all work in global development. What is the vision of how we transform from being complicit to being part of a new way of doing business? And I think the piece that I would love to hear you talk about is, what is the incentive for organizations that are being successful in the way that they do business now? They play the game, they do the right things to get money from donors, they've been successful in growth. What is their incentive to change and to really go into this new way of working, where it is more about devolving power and transferring leadership and allowing for accountability and decision-making at the level of those who are actually affected by the work and participating in the work, rather than being done at the headquarters level or the regional office level or the expatriate level? What's the incentive? How do we get people to move towards this?
To be honest with you, I have seen only one incentive in the sector that works, and that is the donors. If the donors move in a particular direction, the INGOs and the UN move in that direction, because it's the money that really holds all the power. That's the bottom line. However, I haven't been very hopeful about moving the needle on the donor side, and hearing Ratna speak has been extremely fascinating for me, and just giving me hope about the Canadian donors and what you guys are doing. And I hope that that could be the first domino falling maybe in the sector, with the other donors following suit. You say that you guys are less progressive, but what you're talking about is actually far. I don't see many donors having these kinds of serious conversations about colonial history of aid and trying to really devolve power. I don't really, the rules, the regulations are really important, but how, if you have the legal mechanisms to devolve power, as USAID and FCDDO have, they don't have any regulations that inhibit them, but they still refuse to do it. So they have no excuse, really, except that it serves their political interests. That's the reason. So I think that the incentives, really, to be honest with you, have to come from the global South countries. It has to come from the G77. And what has given me hope is the Asian countries, is when I see Indonesia in the last tsunami in 2019 saying, you're not gonna come and do whatever you please like you did in 2004 tsunami. We have learned painfully from that experience. And if you wanna come and support our response, you have to support the government. The government is in the lead. And if you want to support civil society, you have to support Indonesian civil society. And that put a lot of INGOs who raised millions and millions of dollars in northern capitals, all this money they had to burn into the Indonesians' response. And they had no partnerships. They had not devolved power. They had no relationships that were pre-positioned. So they had to all of a sudden scramble and figure out who they could partner with, because the Indonesian government said enough is enough. And when I hear the Filipino government doing the same and so on, that gives me hope that countries will start reclaiming their sovereignty and the space for doing the current kind of aid programs where the governments are weak and marginalized and the aid sector basically calls the shots, is hopefully a diminishing situation. Certainly I haven't seen it too much in Africa, but I hope that it comes more and more where we claim our sovereignty, the government start claiming sovereignty. So that's what gives me hope, that the space will shrink for this current way of working. And secondly, and I think that gives me hope is that INGOs, CEOs, I hear a genuine kind of real self-critique on some CEOs, not all, some CEOs of INGOs. And that gives me hope that these new leaders will actually move things internally and maybe influence the sector. So we are hopeful, and we are working with some of these CEOs as a part of this process that we're calling the Pledge for Change in Adesso. A few CEOs, not many, I think it's about 8 or 9 INGOs that are involved in this process where we have these retreats. So I am hopeful, because I do see some some people who are really thinking about transforming the sector, and that gives me hope. But I know that they're also dealing with their governance challenges. They're dealing with boards who are shocked that maybe they will shrink in size. How do you convince a board that instead of being $100 million NGO, that it's a good thing for us to become a $50 million NGO? You know, how do you convince the board? So these are real, genuine struggles that they have with their boards. So it's a journey. It's not a marathon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I will add I love what you were just saying about, you know, if the countries in the global south actually setting the terms, and I think sticking to the terms is also important once they are set. One thing that I'll mention, I know I've seen a somewhat of a shift in, is around, I think since the question of domestic resource mobilization has been growing in the last 5 years or so, we are seeing far more requirements being actually followed through on around taxation and registration of INGOs and expatriate staff in countries. And I know that this is one of the levers that is pushing INGOs to rethink some of their staffing structure and, frankly, some of their business models in terms of how they exist within these countries and who they can afford to have in the country, what kinds of tax liability they want to actually face and manage. And I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of INGOs right now in several countries that I can think of very quickly. And it is forcing them to change the way they do business. And so to go back to what you said, you know, at the end of the day, it's around money, and whether it's donors making changes to the way that they work that then incentivize the rest of the sector to change to be able to continue the funding, whether it's the countries implementing changes, those all can have an influence on the sector. Deegan, any last thoughts you'd like to share before we move to our next speaker?
I think I just would like to end by saying, you know, I'm not sure if Ratna said this, but we do need to think about the infrastructure for that new ecosystem. How do we support and make it easy for the donors, even the INGOs, to devolve some of these resources with this conversation around risk and capacity building and all of that? And we need to be really, really creative. As Adesso, we're working on a few really innovative solutions to these challenges. But I say that we can't, the status quo is not going to help us. The current structure doesn't work. We have to build alternative structures. We can't just expect that donors are all of a sudden going to start giving millions of dollars to local NGOs tomorrow without addressing their real concerns around these risks. Yes, we do need to have an honest conversation. As you said, we can't legislate for the 1%. But at the same time, the whole conversation is dominated by that 1%. The whole conversation is about that 1%. It's as if that 1% has become the 99.9% or the 99%. So we have to kind of flip that a little bit, but we also have to provide practical solutions to the politicians to make their lives easier.
No, that is such a great point, and I think we need to make sure that those solutions are being designed by those who are actually living the challenges and doing the work, and not have solutions that are cooked up behind somebody's desk in Washington, DC, or Ottawa, or London, so that we move into a way of doing work that also reflects the true realities of how you get that work done. So thank you so much, and I am now going to move us over to Dylan Matthews. Dylan, it's a pleasure to speak with you, and let me just start you off with a question. You all have recently published a really important report around decolonizing aid, and you talk about the risk of finding technocratic solutions. What do you mean by this, and how can that tendency be overcome? Could you tell us more about your report and about that element of it? Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, and great to be here. So first, just to give you some background to the report. So the report is a write-up of an online global consultation that Peace Direct held with Adesso. So Degan was involved in that, and 2 other organizations, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security and the Alliance for Peace Building. And we came together really to hold an open, frank conversation with activists around the world around the issue of structural racism. And that produced 125 pages of comments, which we then sifted through to try and understand what are the key trends, the key themes that are emerging from this very, very rich conversation about structural racism. And I think the first thing to say is that it was really sobering to hear how many practitioners in the Global South had experienced direct, overt racism, as well as structural racism in their own countries. They felt like second-class citizens in their own countries because of the way in which the system currently operates. NGOs, policymakers, and external actors really making decisions on behalf of communities without those communities being meaningfully involved. And it was really there were some very painful sort of stories being shared. We decided not to include the first-hand testimonies, but more a sort of generalized set of recommendations. And so to give you an answer to that question around the sort of technocratic solutions, one of the strands of the conversation was precisely about this, that what's happened is that the sector itself over the years has professionalized and has divorced itself. Hopefully it has tried to obscure the fact that it has its roots in colonialism. It actually came from a colonial history, which the sector is not willing to accept or admit, because we consider ourselves the humanitarians, the better angels of our nature. The idea that we have baggage and a lineage that traces back to the colonial times, and actually some of those issues are still, and the framing of how we see the world and how we intervene is still brought from that period, is deeply problematic and is almost a taboo subject. So the sector itself is unwilling to talk about it up until very, very recently. And when we talk about technocratic options, I mean, we've seen over the decades how the sector has become professionalized. We talk about value for money frameworks, we talk about results frameworks, if you think about localization itself, it has become a technocratic exercise. So organizations are demonstrating how they're local. NGOs are demonstrating how they're local simply by measuring the number of local staff they employ, not necessarily whether there's any power or control by those entities, by local organizations. So the professionalization of the sector, we know that has done good in terms of improving services. Right? So if you look at through one lens, it has improved services, improved standards. But looking through the lens of sort of racial equity and empowerment and actually shifting power, it's done nothing of the sort. It's actually disempowered communities. Most communities and most local organizations feel like they're spectators in their own story. Right? They they feel like they're receiving aid, not necessarily being active participants in that. And so the questions that we were grappling with during this consultation was, how has this come about? To what extent do the international community and the international humanitarian peace building and development sectors really grapple with, are genuinely serious around the issues of structural racism? And or are they finding sort of these technocratic solutions which really just tinker around the edges? Let's talk about the number of local staff that we have. Let's talk about a few checklists that we can tick off to demonstrate that we're trying to do the right thing. But actually, fundamentally, they're not addressing the real issue, which is who holds power? Why is that power being held with the same people in the same ways, and why is it not being shifted to local actors? And what do we need to do to be able to help the system shift? And so throughout the consultation, by day 3 of the consultation, we were starting to really look at some practical recommendations around how we do that. But when it comes to those technocratic solutions, we're very good. The sector's very, very good at doing that. We're excellent at finding, you know, your checklist to sign off and your new framework, whether it's a monitoring and evaluation framework, a results framework, to be able to demonstrate that we're doing something. But are we doing the right things is the question.
And so have you identified, you know, practices that you see working to shift from that kind of technocratic approach that checks the pretty boxes to actually, again, making this change? And I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, I know, you know, we have been pushing for pushing organizations that we work with to move away from, for example, requiring certain university degrees for work that doesn't require those university degrees to do it. And I think this gets back into the idea of representation and actually getting people from communities working in the things that are being done, rather than having external people come in to do that work because they have the technocratic qualifications. So have you seen examples of this, and how would you encourage us to move in this direction?
Well, I think to speak to that particular issue, one of the themes of the consultation was around whose knowledge are we valuing? So how, you know, and there was a strong sense that, you know, from local practitioners, that we are still, you know, the sector devalues local knowledge, devalues indigenous wisdom, indigenous practice, and actually really focuses on Western and externally generated knowledge. Now, that's the knowledge in terms of the problem identification. If you're in the peace building sector, that's around conflict analysis. Who's developing that analysis, and how is that informing programmatic decisions and strategic decisions? So all of this we're importing a lot of external analysis, when actually local practitioners, local researchers are researching their own context, and they are feeling devalued. So actually, one of the recommendations was, rather than looking at those technocratic expertise, look at contextual expertise. Who actually understands their own context? Who has a lived experience of those contexts? And how do you make sure that that is on par with other technical expertise that you might think that is necessary? But actually, let's start to raise up and lift up the value of that local knowledge. Let me give you an example from Peace Direct's own work and governance. So we're talking, and your research, the research that we'd be talking about here is around representation at governance level. In my own organization, we also recognized that our board wasn't diverse enough. And so we've set about looking at diversity and making sure that it's meaningful, and we have people with a lived experience on our board. But we wanted to go further than that, because the reality is, and you mentioned this in the research, boards right now function mainly as either managing risk, or in a lot of boards, it's about fundraising. So actually, those boards don't necessarily deal with some key issues related to strategy and direction of the organization. Of course, nominally, they all have to, right? That's the whole purpose of a board. But in practice, a lot of that is delegated down to the chief executive and the leadership team. So what we looked at was, can we find at Peace Direct another mechanism, an alternative governance mechanism that enables local practitioners and activists to feed directly into our strategy and our direction? So we established what we called a Global Advisory Council. And the Global Advisory Council is almost like a parallel board. It's made up almost entirely of local practitioners, whose role is to be our brain trust, to help guide the organization where it matters most in terms of governance, in terms of strategy, in terms of thinking about some areas of our programs, you know, significant questions around programs. And that they focus on those, and not necessarily about fundraising or risk management, or fiduciary risk, for example, that we still have our board for. So now we have another mechanism by which we can actually tap into this incredible wisdom of and expertise of local practitioners, and that was embraced by our board. Our board actually said that's a great idea. They didn't see it as a threat; they saw it as a complement to their own work. So there are ways in which we can actually, if we think creatively, as organizations, as leaders in our organizations, think about different models of governance that can really help tackle this issue that you talked about in terms of the diversity deficit. So I think that's one way. I think the other thing I would say is that in terms of really trying to shift the sector itself, and starting from the top where we have issues around governance, there are some recommendations in the report that I'd like to share with you. And these are, I think, fairly simple to say, not necessarily easy to enact. The first one is we all have to acknowledge that structural racism exists. Let's start making what was a taboo subject, bring it into the mainstream and have those conversations. It does not mean to imply personal guilt. It is about a collective responsibility to deal with an issue. And that's what we all have to do if we're in this sector. So, acknowledge it, that, and accept that structural racism exists and that we all have a play to try and deal with that. A second one, which is really important, I think, for governance, is to encourage conversations internally about power and externally with your grantees and with your partners about how you hold power and how it is wielded within your organization, but also with your stakeholders, with your constituents. Now, that is not a conversation that most organizations have. They do not have conversations about how power is held and retained. And those grantees and partners are afraid to talk about that for fear of being punished in terms of their funding or long-term partnerships. So we have to then create a culture of openness to critique of our own power, and we have to create space for change. And that means that we have to be humble enough to accept that we're going to make mistakes and that we're going to hear some really uncomfortable things about how we have acted. So these are some, I'd say principles that we should start to look at. Thinking about structural racism, accepting it, thinking about power, how it's wielded, how we are making space for those uncomfortable conversations within our organizations, and being humble about acknowledging the mistakes that we have made. If we can do that, we start to open up space for transformation within our own organizations. And it has to start with us, right? So it has to start with our own, ourselves and our organizations. And the last recommendation, and there are others, and I'd ask you to all, encourage you all to look at the report, is start with yourself. Ask yourself around your own positionality. How have you benefited from, each of us, how have we benefited from this system? How have we reinforced some of these structural racist norms and approaches? And actually start to analyze that and think about how you might change your approach, the use of your language, so that over time things can shift.
Thank you. Those are great recommendations. And I just wanted to follow up on the idea of an advisory board and ask how you selected the members of the advisory board. So how did you look at a group different and profiles different from those that you have on your regular board? And also, how does your regular board and your advisory board interact, or do they?
Sure. So the first criteria was that they have to have deep contextual understanding. So we didn't look at any experience of governance, any experience of managing an organization, any experience of fundraising. It was, do you have a genuine, deep connection with your communities in the countries that we are supporting local peace building efforts? And is that, is there a lived experience there? So that was really the overriding criteria. The second thing we decided was that we weren't going to just pick activists from our partners. So we work with partners around the world. We felt that some should come from our partners so that there was an ownership there of Peace Direct by our partners, but not that it is exclusively from our partners, because there is, of course, a risk of conflict of interest if our partners, it's solely made up of partners, and that can cause governance problems because they might have a vested interest in, for example, Peace Direct staying in a particular country versus moving out of a country or supporting work elsewhere. So we actually opened it up. We asked our network to recommend people who don't know Peace Direct at all, people who are not even based in some of the countries where we work, but who have a sort of deep connection to peace building in their communities. And we just talked to them. So we interviewed lots of activists and just selected a few from those. So they come almost with a clean slate. They know nothing about Peace Direct. They just care about local peace building. And they are here to really hold us to the highest standards of our work. And because they're not partners, we also, and we hope this would be the same for our partners, but for those that are not our partners, there's no risk of there being any repercussions because there's no funding relationship, there's no formal link. So about half of them are from organizations in countries that we don't even work in. And the last, to answer that last point, we have tried to make sure that there's a bridge between the two governance bodies. So the board have some local activists on it, and those local activists are also on our Global Advisory Council. So the Global Advisory Council, when they meet, they will have people who are also board members, and they then can report back to our board to say, this is the conversation that we've had as well. So that link is hopefully very strong. And what we hope in time is that members of the Global Advisory Council, if they show an interest in wanting to understand the sort of risk management and the fundraising and all the other things that, you know, if you sat on a board, some of it is not wildly exciting, let's be honest. It's about other things that we talk about around communications or profile or etc. Well, if they are interested, there's a route then through the Global Advisory Council to our board. So we hope that this model is something we are very hopeful that will work really well for Peace Direct, and so far it has. But we also would encourage others to think about this, because I think right now we tend to think about governance solely as a sort of one option, which is you have to be on the board. Actually, there are other options. You know, you can have subcommittees of boards. You can have co-opted members onto those subcommittees, and subcommittees often have a lot of power because they are responsible for particular areas of work. So some organizations will have a fundraising subcommittee, or they'll have a program subcommittee, they'll have an advocacy subcommittee, and actually bringing those on, you know, local practitioners and local experts into those committees is very important. The last thing I should say is that I absolutely agree that it's really important for us to talk about the board governance of an organization. You know, ultimately that the board owns the organization. In the UK, technically they are the owners of the organization. But as I mentioned, I think that we also have to look more broadly at what does leadership mean? You know, where does leadership sit within an organization? Because in some organizations, it's the senior leadership team and the executive director or chief executive that hold a lot of the power, and the board, as has been described, are fundraisers and connectors in other ways. So in the UK, only 3% of chief executives are non-white in the charity sector, in the non-profit sector, which is appalling. So actually, let's start to think about governance and leadership and representation and inclusion at the senior levels more generally, and not just at the board level.
So I think that's a great final point, but I'll just add that it's the board that hires the chief executives. So the board has to be thinking about that as well when they do have the opportunity to bring in a new organizational lead. So thank you so much, Dylan. We are keeping pretty well to time. I wanted now to look to Lena Beirut from Bond to tell us a little bit about the work that they've been doing. They're just out with a new report as well, and just coming from their annual meeting. So Lena, over to you.
Thanks very much, Christine. It was really wonderful to hear the panelists speak so passionately about this issue, and I just wanted to kind of go through some of my thoughts on that, and then I'll go into the work that we're doing at Bond. And I think all of this really speaks to the approach that Bond is taking. The Senator obviously talked about structures and an NGO moving its headquarters from the north, which is really useful. But it isn't the be all and end all. If we're truly to make change, we need to shift the culture. So there's no point moving offices to Africa, to Asia, if decision making and executive roles are still held in the north. And that's where the power is. Similarly with boards, if you have board members from local communities where you work with the local communities, if they're from outside of the north, if there is not equitable power and decision making held by all of those board members, you're just perpetuating the same kind of culture of inequity. So we do need to think about the structures that we exist in, and how we're addressing inequity, how it's upheld in our organizations and the work that we do as well. We also the panel talked a bit about language, which is so powerful and wonderful that Canada is doing, progressing on that front. The words that we use to describe the work that we do in the sector are so powerful, and we really need to review that and change the language that we use. There is a saying that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, which is exactly true. And Dylan spoke a little bit about expertise as well. Whose expertise do we value and why? Who do we deem as intellectual and intelligent? Is it somebody with multiple degrees, or is it lived experience? So really refocusing that is so important. And accountability of all of this work, even with boards, accountability can only come from one place. It can only come from those local communities that we work with. It can only come from BIPOC people in our organizations. And if we're not creating the space in our culture and our organizations to hear, and more than that, to act upon what we're hearing, then we're not progressing anything, and we're not doing anything to change the status quo. And also moving on to programs and impact, again, the same question: whose eyes are we seeing success through? Who is setting the bar for that? Donors, program leads, where are they based? In the north, or is it actually from the local communities that we work with? Different degrees of what actually is successful. In the UK, interestingly, specifically to boards, the Charity Commission reviewed their governance code just in December last year. And they now have 2 principles which are focusing on EDI, so equality, diversity and inclusion, and integrity. And the whole idea of that is to create a culture change on boards. So to actually create the space where boards can understand the current systems, the cultures, the broader context with which their charity works, so that they can less rush to solutions and to fixing something, but actually make meaningful change that is sustainable and that works for everybody. So boards are being asked to do this. Again, the Charity Commission Code is really guidance for best practice. So the accountability there is an interesting point to make. There are, with the work that Bond's done, we have just had a report that's just come out on Thursday last week, which really was, I guess, leading on from what Dylan talked about in their report. It was centering the voices of marginalised communities and racialised communities throughout the UK and overseas who work in aid. So who really work in this structure that we exist in. And so Bond, membership body for the UK NGOs, we had 150 NGOs feedback. We also did a follow-up survey to specifically racialized people in the sector. And what we found was that 73% of organizations had said they had EDI policies in place. But from our follow-up survey with racialized people, 89% of people said that they felt their organizations weren't truly committed to EDI. And again, 68% of people said that they had experienced an incident of racism in their workplace or had been a witness to it. And this really speaks to the culture that we have in our sector, in our organizations. It's not enough just to talk about the processes and policies that we can change to make different board members perhaps be elected to the board, or different ways of doing our programs if the power has not shifted and if the way that we do the work has not shifted. There's a lot that we still need to do, and one of the things which is really important is for boards to recognize that, and that actually they have a role in changing this. But it isn't just boards. So I will share my screen just quickly now, if I can. Yeah, so this is the master plan from Bond. What we're doing is we identified the roles that hold power in organizations, and these are the people that we're engaging with to start to shift it, because of course we can start to pass laws, and we can well, until those who hold power, like donors outside of our sector, change their thinking on this and ask things differently of us as organizations, things won't change quick enough. And as well as having those systems and structures in place that do invite us to change the way we do our work, we are forgetting about the element of the individual and the personal. There is a lot of this work that needs to happen on an individual and a personal level. And so some of the things that the panelists have already brought up in terms of governance and boards, in terms of programs and who makes decisions, in terms of the language we use, the narrative that we use, which sits with directors of comms and campaigns and fundraising, and policy. We forget about policy as well, but we do a huge amount of advocating in our sector. We are talking to donors, we are talking to governments, we are talking to governments around the world, and yet are those representative of the communities that we work with? These are the questions that we need to talk about. So Bond's piece of work is off the back of the report that came out just last week. We are engaging with the sector in this way across the UK sector, and it is about shifting individuals and building anti-racist practice, which is what we've been doing with the CEOs, the boards. We'll do with directors of programs to talk about those dynamics between being UK headquartered and having country offices, the language and the narrative that we use through the directors of comms, campaigns and fundraising, the directors of policy, and if they have a majority white, because it's a very white area, if they do have a white policy team, to really think about how can they bring this into their team and their conversations when they are going out to advocate for the sector and to lobby the sector, and then HR, who are the gatekeepers of the sector. And we are doing the bubbles at the bottom. You can see these are the things that underpin our work. The Bond Charter is the accountability piece. So this is something that organisations, when they join Bond, they sign up to, and we're looking at how we can make this reflective and more of an accountability piece. We are doing work on our language, decolonizing and depoliticizing our language as well, specifically for the UK. And we are also looking at supporting organisations in HR and in recruitment as well. But at the heart of this is what we use the term POC, people of colour in the sector. So, stop sharing my screen just now, but this is to show that this needs to be a holistic approach to us really shifting things in the sector. It does not just sit at the door of the CEOs or the boards, because if you are not changing it and supporting any policies that you bring in with a cultural and behavioural change at every single level, then change will be very slow in coming. And this is very challenging work, but it's one that we can't shy away from anymore. And we need to be able to talk about the levels of power and privilege that individuals do hold on board level, at senior roles, but at every single level. And we need to talk about what position that puts us in within the sector and how we can start to take steps to disrupt that and to really change the power dynamics. I would say just lastly that, you know, lots of governments and institutions do have their place in addressing racial inequity, but really, again, in order to create real change, we need to get to grips with every single level. This is an everyone problem. It's not just a board problem, and we need to not shy away from the individual work that we will need to do on this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think that's just an incredibly powerful and important idea to kind of end this part of the program with, is this idea that it really is a holistic approach. It requires action and commitment from all levels. I will say one thing that we've touched on, I think each of our speakers has touched on this a little bit, but I want to come back to, is the idea of the donors and where is the money coming from? Because I think that internally it is easier for all of us to say we're going to change our behavior, but if we are confronted with a set of rules, regulations, expectations, standards, what have you, that the donors are setting that make us work to a different framework, we are going to be continuing a different framework. And so we need to be thinking, I think, also about how do we exert pressure and leverage on donors to have them change the way that we work. And again, hearing from Senator Omidvar has been so important, and we'll come back to her in just a moment, because she is giving us an example of how to change things at that government donor level. And so I encourage all of us to be thinking both in terms of the work that we're doing on an everyday level and with our communities and our staff and our boards, but also really thinking with each one of those relationships, what can we be doing to then exert pressure on donors to also change in the direction that we need this to go. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers and look to Senator Omidvar to please provide us with her concluding remarks about what you've heard here and what you're thinking as we go off to our day jobs and looking forward and how we continue the change and the action. Senator. You're on mute.
I'm on mute.
There you are. Now we
yeah.
can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a powerful and deep conversation about governance, diversity, and racism. It's beyond me to summarize it. But I will say this, that these conversations are really important to have, and they start with the gathering of data, as all the speakers and CGD have done. And my question really is, how do we ensure that this data is collected and gathered at a sustained level at regular intervals, so that we can determine whether or not the needle is moving this way or that way. Now, I believe that, in fact, it is governments that must mandate this data collection, partly because I'm a legislator, but I also think international institutions that cover the globe, such as CGD, may also have a role in pulling together the data from different sources, as they have now, but on a regular basis. I am worried, and I really enjoyed listening to Lena and to Dagan and Dylan, but I am worried that this conversation around DEI and governance could become technocratic, as Dylan has suggested. And one expression of that technocracy is, a default to tokenism. And we've seen that time and time and time again. In my own history, I have been a token too many times. Fortunately, I've learned how to use that position to good effect, I hope. The other solution that presents itself to me, and Lena talked about the Charities Commission in the UK, which is a structure we don't have in Canada. I wish we did, but we don't, is that, just as governments mandate the exemption of charitable dollars, they could actually mandate, if they so choose, they could direct charitable tax dollars in the UK, in the US, in Canada, and other places to meet certain targets in terms of equity-seeking groups. I think it's a reach. It's a really far reach, and I have to get my head around it, how you would get to do that. But if philanthropy is the lever, and Dagan said it, it's the 1% that make the decisions. They're the ones who move the needle on all these conversations. Then how do we get to the 1%? I'm not sure we can leave it up to goodwill and education and awareness. I kind of think legislation may be the way to go. And I would love CGD to do a journey around how would you do that? And what would be the context, and how would you develop some guardrails around this? So thank you so much for inviting me. Christine, you're an absolutely marvelous moderator. You shall hear from me soon. And to all the panelists, Dylan, Dagan, Lena, really, really enriching conversations. And I was privileged to listen and hear you.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Senator, for these thoughtful remarks, and also for the challenge to all of us, and including to CGD. And I was going to actually suggest to our audience that if they are part of INGOs working on humanitarian or development issues, but haven't been surveyed in our latest work, that they could submit their data on on diversity and inclusion within their boards, and we would actually build up the dashboard that Rose has presented at the beginning of this session. But thanks to all of you. I'm really grateful to Christine for her wonderful moderation, to all our panelists today for a thought-provoking session. As somebody said at the beginning, it's a difficult conversation, but it's a very much needed one. And of course, thank you to our audience for their engagement in this event. Hopefully it won't be the last conversation, and in CGD we'll continue to think through what the impact of governance, and in particular representation in governance structures and accountability for humanitarian outcomes, and how to shift that paradigm from what I can deliver to actually what people tell me they need. We'll continue to think those issues through. Thank you very much to all, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.